When I was 20, I went on a road trip with my friends to see a comet that hasn't passed by Earth in the past 2,000 years, called the Mephistopheles Comet. It was going to be visible from most of Maine where we live, but to get the best view of it, my friend Matt wanted to go out into a remote part of the woods to see it unobscured by others, or the light pollution in the area. Going out to the woods was nothing new for us. Matt and I would always head out there to hunt or hike or just go for the hell of it. I was excited to see it, especially since I was taking an astronomy class and would be writing my term paper about the comet and its history. Seeing it for myself would be a good piece to add to it. I was working on the paper with our friend Keller, so we invited him along as well. The three of us would leave town about an hour before the comet was set to arrive and camp out near a place called Oyster River to get a good view of it. Once we got to the river, we set up camp, and the telescope needed to see the comet. The comet was going to be bright enough to see with the naked eye, but I wanted to see it as clearly as possible. We sat there for about half an hour, just drinking and joking around with each other, when Keller finally said, "Look, there it is," and pointed to the sky. Matt and Keller got out their phones to take pictures of the comet, and I put my eye up to the telescope to see it in all of its glory, and Keller got his notepad out to record all our own observations on it. The comet was breathtaking as it glided across the sky, leaving a dark red streak that followed it. It was beautiful, but also ominous. The comet looked as though it was tearing the sky in half. The trail behind it wasn't fading away, and it was turning the sky from the pitch black to a burning crimson. The stars surrounding it seemed to distort as it passed as well, as if they were pushed out of the path of the comet. Suddenly, it started to glow brighter in the sky, making it impossible to directly stare at from the telescope anymore. I stepped back and stared at it in the sky. "What's going on?" I asked. "This isn't how A deafening blow was shot from the sky. It sounded almost like a horn before I could finish my thought. The sound reverberated from the trees in the woods that surrounded us. I jumped from the sudden explosion of sound and fell to the ground in shock. I had no idea what just happened. As soon as I was able to get back up, I looked around for Matt and Keller, hoping both of them were okay, and eager to figure out what caused the eruption of noise. A wave of relief washed over me when I saw both of them rising to their feet as well. They appeared to be okay, but just as shocked and confused as I was, with a look of, "What the fuck just happened?" on their faces. I ran over to them and tried to scream, "Are you guys okay?" when I realized nothing came out when I yelled. Not only that, all the sounds of the woods had vanished. The birds, the wind blowing, even the sounds of rushing water in the lake had all just disappeared, all replaced by the sound of silence, not our ears ringing, but complete and utter silence. The temperature outside had suddenly dropped as well. It was the middle of June, at least 70 degrees out, but now it felt like we were standing in the middle of a freezer. Matt and I ran towards each other, screaming in each other's ears to attempt to get any sort of message across, but all falling on deaf ears. All of that didn't matter, however, when we realized just how cold we were getting. Luckily, Keller was quick at work getting a fire started, so we could. Once the fire had been lit, we all gathered around it, taking in the warmth that radiated from it. It seemed as though the warmer we got, the sounds slowly started to return to the woods. We were all trying to rationalize what had happened and were eager to get back to town. "Maybe it was just how this comet behaves," I said, trying to reassure everyone. "Hey, is anyone else's phone working?" Matt said. I reached into my own pocket and pulled out my phone. The pitch-black screen reflected my own face back onto me, and I saw that my fake composure was quickly cracking as the phone refused to start up. Maybe the comet's energy is messing with it or something. It should turn on soon," I said quickly and shakily, trying to convince my friends it would be okay. But I think I was really only trying to convince myself. "What the fuck is that?" Keller whispered in fear. We all quickly turned to where he was looking and saw dozens of deer standing still and blocking the road we drove in on. Barely illuminated by the edges of the campfire, they were just staring at us. We watched them for what seemed like hours, unwilling to take our eyes off of them, as if we were in a life-or-death staring contest. The more we watched, the more we realized the deer weren't doing anything other than staring. They weren't moving at all. They weren't blinking. They weren't even breathing. We knew we couldn't stand there forever. Whatever was happening was freaking us all out, and we wanted to leave as soon as possible. Once we all felt we had warmed up, I took the keys out of my pocket and told everyone we were leaving and we could come back and pack up camp in the morning. There were no objections, as I'm sure they were just as, if not, more freaked out than I was. What about the deer? Matt whispered quietly. I knew the deer would have to be moved in order to get out, and that one of us would have to go over to get them out of the way. Okay, who's going to move them? I asked, knowing no one was going to raise their hand to answer. We could play for it, Keller said, holding his right hand in a fist over his left hand. I sighed but put my own hands up to participate in the game. We each struck our fists on our open hands 3 times and on shoot released the symbol we chose to play with. Keller and Matt had both chosen rock, and I had chosen scissors. However, we quickly realized this game was played in vain as the car wouldn't start. Frustrated and terrified, we begrudgingly decided to stick together to make our way to the path before us and call a tow truck in the morning. As we put out the fire Keller had started, the cold slowly started to keep back in, shrouding us in cover of frost. We quickly grabbed our bags and moved forwards, wanting to make our way back to town as quickly as possible. The closer we got to the deer at the end of the trail, the stranger the entire situation was getting. The deer hadn't even blinked as we walked closer, even as we were within arm's reach of it. I put up my arms in an attempt to scare off the deer, but they didn't move at all, even when we started yelling at them. We were quickly getting tired of trying to interact with them, so we decided to just go around them. As we started to walk around them, Keller bumped into one, and it instantly fell over, as if it were a mannequin of a deer. This new revelation horrified us. We had no idea what had happened to these deer. All of them were just positioned to be looking at us. We decided it would be best to keep moving and move as quickly as we could to get back home. As I turned around to take one last look at the sky as if it would reveal all of the answers to our quickly growing pile of questions, I saw that all of the deer had turned around and were now looking at us again. We never expected it to get this cold. The drive here had only been 20 minutes at most, so we hoped to make it back on foot in about 2 hours. The cold was getting to us, however. We didn't understand how it felt like 20 degrees in the middle of summer, but all we could hope was that we could make it back home before it could get any colder. I've never realized until then just how hard it is to see at night without the use of headlights. What little moonlight that was able to infiltrate through the thick cluster of tree branches was barely enough to illuminate the path ahead of us. It was a new growing fear that we may get lost and have to spend the night out in this unexplainable cold. That is, if it were even possible for the sun to rise again. The more we walked, the more I began to fear, not just for our safety, but for the safety of everyone back in town. Was it just as cold there? Did the power get cut off there too? Was the town infested by those fucked up deer we saw in the woods? Or maybe the town was completely fine, and everyone got to see the comet from a safe distance, and had no idea what was happening to us out here, and would have no idea to look for us. I don't know why, but that last thought seemed to scare me the most, that we could be dead by the morning, and no one would start to think that to look for us until it was too late. I was instantly snapped back into reality by Matt and Keller stopping abruptly, suddenly bringing my train of thought to a screeching halt that threatened to derail it entirely. At the end of the new stretch of road we had just turned onto was a jet-black car, one darker than the night that surrounded us. The headlights were a welcome sight as it cut through the oppressive darkness that laid ahead, even if it was blinding us. However, this vehicle that should have filled me with a new sense of hope now filled me with an even deeper sense of dread. We had no idea who this was. We had never seen this car before. It looked too nice to be from the town all of us lived in. And who would be out here at this time of night? Even if he was here to see the comet like us, shouldn't his car have been messed up by the comet too? We stood there for what felt like forever, holding our hands out in front of our eyes to shield them from the assaulting beams of light, and waiting for the man inside to identify himself. After a few minutes, the man exited the car. He stood tall, maybe around 6 feet tall. He was dressed in an elegant white suit and had short, curly blonde hair. He seemed like a normal and even friendly face, save for the giant ear-to-ear smile that stuck something deep within us that something was terribly wrong with this person. "Hello there," he called to us in a voice that was warm and inviting, yet somehow dripped with a drop of venom at the end of it. "Awfully cold for you boys to be out here on foot. Do you need a ride back to town?" he asked. "I think there's a town nearby, Rockport, I think. If that's not your home, I'm sure they'll be able to take you back there." The man said all of this in a calm yet booming voice, his smile not slipping for a second as he spoke. "I got the heater on in the car," he added, somehow feeling a slight blessing of the warmth that beckoned to us from within the car as he said that. "No, thank you," I said. "I think we can make it the rest of the way back." I didn't want to be rude and reject this seemingly nice man's generous offer, but there was something seriously wrong with the way he was. I looked back to my friends and saw they had the same worries as me, but I could tell they were wrestling with the options in their heads. The cold was getting to all of us, and even though we didn't say it, we were all worried we might not even make it all the way home. This man might be our only way out of this alive, and I could be throwing away our one shot at making it out. Keller suddenly spoke up. I'll go, if there's enough room. That is," I could tell by his voice how terrified he was. I know he was scared to ask, but that he thought this might be better than what could happen if he didn't accept. "Of course," the man said, his smile widening even greater than I thought that human anatomy could allow. "There's plenty of room and warmth for everyone who needs it." Matt and I said nothing, even knowing this could be our only way out. Every fiber of our being, and every instinct that we had screamed at us to not enter that car, that if we did, we would never make it back home alive. We knew Keller felt this too, but the cold had taken so much of his energy and hope that he was willing to accept whatever fate may lie before him. I gripped his shoulder tightly as he took a step towards the car, saying nothing with my words, but my tightening grip on him saying everything. He looked back at me with a look in his eyes that said everything, a look in his eyes that I could never forget. "I'll be back before you, and I'll be back with my car to pick you guys up," he said, in an obviously fake attempt to look calm. My grip on his shoulder loosened and eventually dropped as he walked into the car as I realized I would never see my friend again. I stood there in a stunned silence, wondering how I could let him do that and what would happen to him. I felt like I stood there for a lifetime, and even now, I still feel like I'm standing there being blinded by the headlights of the car I saw that night and unable to see what would become of Keller after he walked into that vehicle. A few moments after the car had driven off, I truly grasped the reality of what just happened. I fell to my knees and looked back at Matt, realizing he had already fallen to his knees weeping a long time ago. What was supposed to be a fun night for us to be mesmerized by the beauty of the natural world had turned into our own little slice of hell. Matt and I just sat there, sobbing for a bit. The pain of losing our friend had dulled us to the fact that the cold was receding, and warmth had slowly started to work its way back into the woods. We slowly realized this warmth was coming from the sun, which was finally making its way back to save us from the night, but had been much too late for Keller. Slowly rising to our feet, we said nothing as we walked back to town for the next hour, having nothing more to say about the night we had just survived. So why say anything? Making it to the next morning didn't feel like succeeding, not without Keller. The only thing I could think of as we walked back to town was what I could possibly tell his family. We walked back into town as shadowed husks of the men who had driven off in excitement of seeing a once-in-a-millennium natural phenomenon. Neither of us replied to the worried questions of the members of our community. The first time I spoke again was when I walked into the police station to report Keller missing, knowing full well he was already dead. The police mounted a search for him immediately and found him very quickly. He was mangled beyond recognition, like he had been left in a bear's den for weeks on end. He was holding a pen and paper in his hands that he brought with him to write about the comet, as if he was attempting to leave a final message to us and his family. His body was already going through decomposition when they found him, as if he was dead out there for weeks in the summer sun. Despite all of these injuries to him and the state of decay he was found in, his death was ruled as hypothermia. After interviewing us, the police searched for weeks in the car, but were never able to find him. Neither Matt nor I were able to see the license plate or what brand of car he was driving. The police suspected us when we told them what happened that night, but we were immediately ruled out as the police had no explanation as to how someone dies of hypothermia and decays overnight when the town never noticed anything weird that happened in the woods. As we sat there in the woods, Keller's family was brought in to identify his body. I'll never forget the way his parents screamed when they saw the state he had been left in. His funeral was held a week later. Not much preparation had to be done to it as it was a small town, and the funeral was a closed casket. I'm not a very religious person, but I went in honor of my friend. Maybe I could offer some sort of apology he could hear if he was in fact in a better place. Even though I went to honor my friend, I couldn't bear to look his parents in the eyes. Every time I had since then, I saw the same look Keller gave me that night before he walked into that car. To avoid looking at anyone, I sat in the back as the priest gave his sermon about how Keller was with God now. I grabbed a Bible off of the seat in front of me and started to read to avoid looking into anyone's eyes, when I saw this line in Revelations 9:1. And the fifth angel sounded, and I saw a star fall from heaven unto the earth, and to him was given the key of the bottomless pit. I mad dashed through the woods, tripping, scraping, and slamming into twisted, dense foliage. I couldn't think over my own loud breathing. It vibrated through my whole body, deafening. Then something slammed into me and sent me colliding into a tree. I fell to the dirt, everything around me blurry. I was bleeding all over, but didn't know from where. A large silhouette loomed over me. I then woke up. That was the nightmare I had right before the incident. At the time, it felt real and shook me up a bit, but I was already shaken up pretty bad. My dog, my best friend, died 2 weeks ago, and I wasn't even close to recovering. At that time, Jet was my family. She was 14. She had a good life and was well taken care of. My wife and I never had kids, so Jet was our baby. I was married, but my wife died 2 years ago. I will never recover from that. I lay there in bed, not wanting to get up. I was kind of in this coma-like depression for days. I didn't want to do anything but lie in bed and watch anything that would make me forget for at least a little while. I was expected to go back to work next week. I really didn't know how that would happen and was debating on just quitting. But that was for my future self to deal with. I had an anniversary to focus on. So I dragged my bag of bones out of bed. I picked up Jet's ashes from the crematorium I took her to. She was a 50-pound blue healer. I went home and divided up her ashes into two. One would stay at the place. The other was coming with me on my trip. I then packed up my small SUV and drove off into the deep wilderness. The city we lived in was at the edge of a massive forest. Some of it BLM land, Bureau of Land Management. Some of it private, some of it federal park. It was a giant patchwork that went for hundreds of miles. It took me about 3 hours to get to where I wanted to get. It was a very off-grid campsite on BLM land, Jet's favorite place on the planet. At least that's what my impression always was. We would come here with my wife. Those were really good times. It was only a 30-yard walk from parking my car to the campsite. I set up a small fire pit and a tent. I was planning on only staying one night. 3 years back on the day before Emma died, the sky was gorgeous with stars and there was an epic meteor shower. As my wife and I sat there watching this beautiful celestial show, Jet sat next to us and watched as well. The three of us sat there for hours stargazing. My wife and I would hoot and holler, and Jet would bark at the best shooting stars, so I was going to wait until it got dark to spread Jet's ashes there, along with a little bit of my wife's. I brought with me a cot, some food, and my revolver with dozens of rounds. I was out in the middle of nowhere, with the closest ranger station being over 200 miles away. There were grizzlies and mountain lions in the nearby hills, but I was always more worried about the people who didn't want to be found. Maybe I was becoming one of them. I was having lots of thoughts about my purpose in life, and if I even wanted to be on the planet anymore. I lost my parents a while back, not because they died, but because they were a-holes. One was a narcissist dick, the other was a manipulating witch. One of the best things I ever did in my life was cut them off, but now I truly had nobody. All my grandparents had died when I was young, and my parents stopped talking to their siblings and cousins decades ago. It was as if they wanted our lineage to end. I had a FDD-up family. Emma and Jet were everything to me. Emma lost her parents when she was young. I had some friends. My best friend moved across the country for a job last year. You could say that I was in a very dark space. That night I ate, drank, and watched the stars. I then spread Jet's and Emma's ashes. I won't lie. I cried a lot. At one point it seemed like I was a volcano. For the last few days before I hadn't been crying. But for the past few months I had cried every day since I found out about Jet's aggressive cancer. I think I was pent up and ready to explode. It did help me go to sleep that night. That and a liter of Jack Daniels. I can't remember now if I woke up and heard it or if it woke me up. But I heard the smashing of glass. It came from where my car was and sounded like a windshield breaking. I then heard a loud bang. It was like something heavy hitting the metal on the SUV and denting it. Neither sounded good. The sounds were relentless. It was like someone was bombarding my car. More glass shattered. I grabbed my gun and peeked out of the tent. There was a half moon in the sky, so it wasn't pitch dark, but I couldn't see much in the shadows of the forest canopy. My campfire was completely dead as I had extinguished it. I kept hearing my car being under siege. I thought of two options, firing my gun into the sky or moving closer and try to see more. I then fired my gun into the air. Pop, pop, pop. I quickly reloaded my 5-chamber. I grabbed a handful of bullets and put them in my pocket and grabbed my phone. The noise at my car stopped. I stood there quietly inside my tent, but my head, gun, and camera peeking out. I scanned the area with both my eyes and lens. An eerie silence spread over the murky land. There was not a sound in the air. I then heard a creak. Something whizzed by my head, loud and fast. I then heard another, and it dawned on me that something was throwing things at me. And that's when I got nailed in the shoulder. I fell back into the tent, my shoulder on fire. I saw what hit me as it rolled across the tent. It was a rock around the size of a baseball. My phone was on the ground next to it, completely shattered. I then heard footsteps outside. Something was charging my tent. It was the adrenaline that gave me the kick. I got up, went to the opening, and looked out. A hairy humanoid shadow was sprinting at me. I fired off 3 rounds right at him. I think one landed. I was a pretty good shot, as I'd go regularly to a shooting range. The human-like something changed course and dashed into some nearby bushes. It stayed there, in a dense patch of green shadows. But then a rock ripped out of the darkness at me. I moved, and I think it barely missed my face as it zipped past my ear like a hummingbird. I fired my last 2 rounds at the spot, then quickly reloaded and fired off 5 more. I reloaded and waited, watching the shrubs and bushes sway slightly in the wind, their branches clicking. Nothing else moved for what seemed like an eternity. I then said, "Who are you?" I know that's so lame, but I think that's pretty much all I said over and over again. I was focused on the shadows. But then I heard this awful sound come from there. It wasn't human, but it also wasn't animal. It was a cry. It then cried out louder. That's when I heard another cry in the forest, a deeper one. But then the beast closer to me stopped. The cry from the distant forest rang out again, but the one nearby didn't respond. Again the distant cry came, but more distraught. The only reply it got was two other distant, different cries. I realized that there was at least 3 more of these things and that they were all around me. I knew I had to get the hell out of there. I put on my shoes and readied a backpack as fast as possible. I thought about going to my car. The unresponsive beast was right between my tent and my car. Nonetheless, I was going for it. But then I hesitated as I thought it could be a trap. The absurdity of the moment gripped me. All my life I wanted to see a Bigfoot, and now I was being attacked by them. The universe really just wanted to end me, and maybe I should have taken the clue right there. Instead, I scooped up my busted phone and took it with me even though its screen was shattered. I readied my gun and ran to my car. As I moved past the bushes, I saw the thing sprawled on the ground. Even though its fur was dark, I could see it was very wet on the chest. It was red blood. The thing didn't move. I broke in my tracks. Crazy as it sounds, I had to get a better look as I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The beast must have been a wretched missing link. It had dark brown fur, was over 6 feet tall and 220 pounds. It was lean but muscular, had long arms, a thick brow, and a gorilla's snout. It didn't move at all. I was pretty sure it was dead. I tried to use my phone as I could tell it was still powered on. I tried double-clicking the side, which would auto bring up the camera mode. I hit the screen, hoping that maybe my phone would get one good pic as the camera lens wasn't cracked. A terrifying howl ripped through the night like thunder. It came from nearby. I turned and saw a larger beast's silhouette about 15 yards away. It was next to my vehicle and was seemingly staring at me. I stood frozen. I remember clenching my gun so tight that my nails punctured my flesh. The thing then ran like a giant ape and flipped my car over. The funny thing about this was at that moment, I remember thinking that Emma and I should have really bought the one I wanted, a much heavier Ford Bronco. I fired my gun into the air, all 5 rounds. The thing froze and watched me like a statue. I quickly reloaded. I then heard 2 other beasts coming out of the woods at me. I was in the process of reloading and dropped a few bullets. I thought about firing on them, but they were surrounding me. I had one opening to escape. Something whizzed by my head, so I mad dashed into denser woods. Thankfully, it was flat land. The beasts were right behind me. I bolted a good 50 to 60 yards. I was somehow pulling away from them, but my cardio was shit at that time. I knew if I had to keep running, I'd be done for. One of them was faster than the others. It kept getting closer, and I would fire on it, and it would quickly dodge behind trees. I could hear rocks whistling around me. I think one hit me in the back, but my backpack absorbed it. I then got to the edge of a large pool of water tangled with tall grass. I stayed on the edge of this murky wetlands and continued to run. I heard the beasts shriek while they chased me. They kept throwing rocks. I wildly fired my gun back at them. I never could get a clean shot, as one was always hurling rocks or flanking me. Their pace was increasing as mine was slowing. One must have picked up a handful of smaller rocks as I felt them pelt me. As they closed in, I then plunged into the bog knee-deep. The water's edge was a thick, murky soup. Clearer water lay deeper away. Agitated and shrieking, the beasts stayed on the water's edge. They threw rocks as I quickly wadded towards deeper water and fired at them. The beasts then jumped in. I tucked my gun, tossed my backpack off, and dove into deeper water and swam my heart out. I swam a lot when I was a kid. I got to land on the other side and scrambled out of the pond. I instantly realized my gun was gone. It must have fallen loose. The beasts emerged from the bog right behind me. I bolted through darker, denser wetlands, dodging and ducking branches, leaping over soggy shrubs. I slipped and fell down a crevice. I slammed against a fallen tree where a decomposing enormous tree had fallen. Other fallen trees lay across it, lodged into the land and creating a hollow underneath, a tight crawl space to hide in. I quickly climbed down into the hollow. Inside, I squeezed into the small cave made of sludge, soil, and twisted roots. I went quiet as I heard the beasts enter the area, at least 2 of them. They slowed down. I heard their steps breaking branches as they seemed to be moving closer to the fallen trees and the hollow I was inside. I peeked out and saw one of them approaching, less than 10 feet away. Not wanting to be trapped, I quickly tumbled out of the hollow and hid behind another decomposing tree. I thought for sure that the beast saw me. I hid in a patch of ferns, but it didn't see me. I watched it look into the hollow and even crawl inside a bit. The other beast scanned the area, and I thought our eyes locked for a moment. I closed my eyes and lay still in the mud. I was covered in slimy muck and hoped that I blended into the land. I heard the beast slowly move towards me, one stealthy step, then another, barely making a sound. But I knew it was there. I kept my eyes closed and my cheek planted in the soil. The beast kept moving towards me. I then heard the other beast enter my vicinity. They seemed to be on each side of me and closing in. As they moved towards me, I thought about popping up and bolting away. But then something else struck me. Did I even care to die? I had contemplated this question since Emma crossed over, but Jet was then my reason to keep going, to take care of her. But then when she left me, I thought about just standing up and letting them rip me apart, tearing me limb from limb, or smashing my skull with a giant rock. Maybe it would be fast, maybe it would be slow and terrible. I didn't really know if I cared. I then heard the loud crack of a branch breaking under a heavy weight and realized the beasts were right next to me. I peeked open an eye and saw a big, matted, hairy foot right in front of my face. I was just about to get up and accept my fate, but then, as if she were right there over my shoulder, I swear to everything that is holy to me that I heard Emma's voice say, "Stay." When I heard it, I froze solid as stone. Strange sounds came from the beasts. It was as if the two beasts were talking to each other. I heard the beasts sniffing. They made more odd noises, grunting and growling. Then one shrieked, then the other one. I tried not to move. They were both right-a-fing next to me. I was holding my breath, but couldn't much longer. They were going to see me. It was going to happen soon. Time stopped. I thought I was done for and would be joining Emma and Jet, and it filled me with joy. So much joy. But then the beasts ran off. I heard their footsteps fade deeper and deeper away. I was still holding my breath. A long moment went by. The wind rustled some trees, but I didn't hear anything else. I opened my eyes. I realized just how well I blended in with the land. My whole body was covered in thick muck. When I slid into this spot, the muddy dirt and plants smooshed over me. I then quickly scrambled back to the hollow and climbed in, squeezing all the way inside. It was easy because I was so slimed up. I tried to get comfortable, which didn't seem possible in the mushy peat pit. I didn't sleep, my body in a daze, my mind racing. All I could think about was, why did I live? Did Emma speak to me? Was it just my mind playing tricks? Why was I so alone and left to miss them so much? Why couldn't I have just died and joined them? When the early morning sun shined across the hollow, I peeked out. Birds were chirping. The forest looked beautiful and peaceful. I made my way out of the hollow, crouched down low, expecting the beasts. But none appeared. I knew there was a gas station I had passed that was south of my campsite. It was around 200 miles away. I used the sun to navigate south and began to walk, always anticipating that I could get attacked at any moment. It took me 6 days of sustaining on berries and creek water, and 6 nights of sleeping in creepy forest crawl spaces. I thought for sure a snake, nasty spider, or bear would get me instead of Bigfoot or dehydration. Somehow I made it to the highway and eventually the gas station. My feet were destroyed. I had blisters on top of blisters, bruises on top of bruises. I felt like some bones were broken in my foot and maybe ribs. My muscles were cramped and swollen. I was a complete mess, both physically and emotionally. I was a lost man who decided to keep living. I told 2 forest rangers my story. They gave me their full attention, as I must have been entertaining as hell. This crazy man covered in dry mud and berries, out there in no man's land to spread my family's ashes on some sentimental journey. They wrote everything down and just said, "We'll investigate and see what we find." I don't know if they believed me. I did feel like one was holding something back. The other, much older ranger, seemed to be keeping her in check. I still had my phone, but it was completely destroyed. I took it to a tech guy who was able to access its hard drive, but there were no pictures there. The ranger followed up with me a few days later saying they found my campsite, overturned vehicle, and empty liquor bottles. They didn't find any body or even traces of blood anywhere. He insinuated that I may have been incredibly distraught and heavily intoxicated because of my loss and perhaps drove drunk and flipped my own car over. And maybe I was a bit delusional, perhaps even concussed. I didn't argue or fight back. It did sound crazy. I didn't care if they believed me. I know what I experienced. I'm currently sitting in my terribly empty apartment right now, listening to the noise of the city outside. I needed to share this story with others as I'm truly lost and don't know what to do next. My wife and I, after hearing a scream, ventured away from our campsite and headed towards the direction of the sound. After a few minutes of light hiking, we came upon the grounds of a cabin. There was a car parked out front, and beside this were the gruesomely shredded remains of a wolf. There were various trails of blood, one of which led from the car and up the porch to the front door of the cabin. The door itself had been partially loosed from its hinges and was leaning inward. The threshold was marked by several scratches, many of them deep. The whole area was like the scene of some crime, a site of savage butchery. Inside, just beneath the door, we found a body, savagely wounded. The person had obviously been dead for hours. There was a smoldering fire in the fireplace, and beside it was a laptop, its battery nearly dead. Something horrible had obviously happened. So I took the laptop with me back to our campsite and read the document displayed on the screen, while my wife reported what we'd found to the authorities. Knowing how the local police will react to this, I've decided to upload what I found. I think the person's tragic story deserves to be told, rather than be disregarded and locked away as evidence. Here it is. There are people living in the woods who have forfeited their claim to society. People who, for some insane, misanthropic reason, have decided to unshackle themselves from behavioral restraints such as civility, courtesy, and mercy. People who perform atrocious, abominable things in twisted service to some dark woodland spirit. While making a trip to a river near my dad's cabin, where we were going to lodge for the weekend, my friend Tim and I encountered one such person. We saw them conducting some strange rite in an open, moonlit area of the woods, a small clearing from which the nearby trees seemed to be consciously leaning away. The person, wretched in all aspects of appearance, wearing only a disgustingly soiled loincloth, was standing in a small rock-lined hole in the ground, which they'd filled with what was unmistakably blood. There wasn't any evidence to guess from what animal it had come. Hungry and tired from having spent most of the day exploring the area, Tim and I stood frozen at the entrance to the clearing, unsure of what to do. Before we could even think to turn away, the ghoulish person spotted us and let loose a series of incomprehensible words, which seemed darkly profane, despite their unfamiliarity. Its skin was sallow and mottled by blotches and smears of brown and crimson, stains from its obscene acts. I tried to apologize, told them that we'd leave them to their business. I used them because it was impossible to tell if they were male or female, but they only cackled maniacally in response and climbed out of the hole. Tim apparently wasn't as repulsed as I was because he approached them, repeating what I'd said. The savage person spouted a few more foul words and then, without warning or any provocation from Tim, reached for something beneath their loincloth. I hadn't seen anything hanging there before, but when they withdrew their hand, there was a small, round, leathery object, no larger than a baseball. I immediately got bad vibes from it, and Tim must have as well, because he turned to me and motioned for me to move away. I did, and beckoned for him to follow. But before he could retreat, the crazed person leapt forward, seized him in a surprisingly powerful hold around the waist, and bit him on the neck. Tim fell down, and the roughly spherical object the deranged person had been holding rolled away. Something about its movement reminded me of something else, but I ignored the thought and went to Tim's aid. The feral thing was attacking him, clawing at his stomach with its savagely long nails, and Tim was repeatedly thrown off balance by the pack still attached to his back. Reaching them, I managed to pull the madman away, but not before it dealt a final debilitating blow to Tim's abdomen. Blood spurted from the wound, and Tim's voice became high-pitched and strained. Panicking, I tried to help him, but there was just too much blood, and we foolishly hadn't brought any of our first aid supplies with us from the car. Capitalizing on my indecision, the feral thing struck me in the head with a black-knuckled fist, and I fell to the ground. I watched, watery-eyed, as he wrapped Tim up in some kind of snare he'd pulled from a cavity in the earth. He worked quickly and had Tim tightly wrapped in only a matter of seconds. Not yet done, the madman reached for the object it had dropped, and after a wicked gurgled laugh, squeezed it in its palm. There was then a dusty explosion and a wave of heat, and I was lifted and thrown back several feet. As I struggled against disorientation, I heard wicked laughter, darkly triumphant, and then the faint sounds of departing footsteps. In the explosion, one of the pieces of shrapnel from a blasted tree had struck me in the leg, nailing me to the ground. The piece, a large, misshapen spike, was partly lodged in my thigh, the rest of it buried deep in the earth. Tim was a few feet away, squirming restlessly in the netting. The homemade bomb's detonation hadn't harmed him, at least not to any degree that would have inhibited his movement. He snarled and hissed as he struggled to free himself, which in turn caused me to panic, and in my panicking I only worsened the pain of my leg wound. Blood gushed from my thigh, and I felt a wave of nausea at the sight, and then an alarming sensation of lightheadedness. When some of the dust cleared, I saw why Tim was snarling and hissing, and it wasn't because of any pain or frustration caused by his ensnarement. Tim's eyes were now red, and his face appeared as ghoulish as the crazed man's. His body trembled uncontrollably, and his limbs jerked around spasmodically. In his struggling, he'd opened the wound in his abdomen even more, and some of his guts had fallen out in a loose bundle. I could smell them, and started to choke from the awful stench. Tim obviously wasn't Tim anymore, had been turned into something monstrous by that abominable wood-dwelling fiend. Moving only caused more pain and more blood loss, and yet I had to move because Tim's restraints were coming undone. His sheer undead tirelessness was quickly loosening the knots. In mere seconds he'd be free. With my heart pounding in my chest and tears streaming from my eyes, I grasped the chunk of blackened wood and slowly pulled it free of my leg. The pain was indescribable. There is no comparable analogy I can think of to accurately express the agony of that grisly unsheathing. When the piece was out, blood started flowing even more profusely, so I gathered a handful of dirt and packed it into the wound, then used a leaf as a makeshift bandage, my blood working as an adhesive. It was unsanitary, an invitation for infection, but I didn't have any other option at the time. I don't know if it was the scent of my abundantly fresh blood, or the excitation of his binds coming undone, but Tim's activity increased tenfold, and only a moment later he was free of the vine-like ropes. The sight of him rising to his feet, viscera hanging loosely from the tear in his shirt, was sufficiently terrifying to induce my own state of hyperactivity. Ignoring the pain in my leg, I scrambled to my feet and hobbled toward the cabin, while behind me Tim ambled in a horrifyingly inhuman fashion. I didn't bother ducking beneath branches, but plowed through them, certain that if I made any overt maneuvers, I'd collapse and fall prey to my cannibalistically ravenous friend. Thankfully, a wolf, perhaps having scented my blood, came howling from some dark corner of the woods, and the noise briefly distracted Tim. In the absence of his pursuit, I managed to enter the front lawn of the cabin, where I found my backpack lying on the ground by the car, its pouches unzipped. Wasting no time, I went searching for my car keys and found them just where I'd left them. There was a commotion in the woods behind me, the details of which were hidden from view by the shadows. I wasn't sure who I hoped was the victor. If Tim, it meant that he's stronger than a wild wolf. If the wolf, then there might be an undead wolf, which I knew was not something I'd be able to contend with. Feeling the return of the lightheadedness and the accompanying panic, I quickly limped around the car to the driver's side. I climbed in, shut the door, and inserted the keys, resisting the desire to take a break now that I was in a safe space. I turned the key, anticipating the wonderful sound of the ignition starting, but nothing came. Trying again, I was met with the same silence, the same mechanical inactivity. With a groan and another wave of pain, I managed to get out of the car and hobble around to the front. Upon opening the hood, I was met with a startling sight, one that sent my heart plummeting into my stomach. The engine was missing. In my absence, someone had removed it. I had my ideas who that someone might have been, but knew that it no longer mattered, that there wasn't anything I could do about it. A feeling of extreme tiredness then hit me, and all I wanted to do in that moment was to lie down on the grass and rest. But just then, something stirred the bushes just beyond the lawn. Leaning against the car, I turned toward the source of the sound and saw Tim emerge from the shadows, drenched in blood, with several new gashes on his face, neck, and chest. The wolf had put up a savage fight. In Tim's right hand was the animal's mangled corpse, what was left of it, which he dragged from the site of their brawl. Looking me in the eye, his bloodshot and full of malice, he tossed the limp carcass toward me, and it landed with a wet thump just a few feet away. The thing looked sickeningly deflated, and I saw a large chunk of its abdomen missing. Tim had fed on the thing after killing it, but apparently he hadn't been satisfied by the meal, because after an inarticulate and possibly derisive gurgle, he came lunging at me, bloody hands outstretched. Surprising Tim, and even myself, I managed to avoid his grab by pushing away from the car, sending myself falling a good distance away. Tim collided with the car, and I nearly vomited at hearing the wet slap of his entrails against the door. Knowing I wouldn't be able to dodge another one of his attacks again, I began crawling toward the door of the cabin, thinking it better to lock myself inside than go running off aimlessly into the woods. With tears in my eyes, I mounted the porch and reached the front door. Thankfully, I'd left it unlocked, and with the last reserves of my strength, I pushed it open, and using the door frame, pulled myself inside. Just as I shut the door, Tim came running up the porch steps. His body collided ineffectually against the door. He reared back and charged it again, and I remained conscious only long enough to be sure that the door would hold. With no strength left in me, I passed out. I awoke a few hours later feeling no better than before. It was still night outside, and the stenches of death and early decomposition were not only still in the air, but were more prevalent than they'd been during my flight from Tim. Sitting up, I checked the door and laughed softly to myself at seeing it unlocked. My foot, the one belonging to the punctured leg, had acted as a doorstop through the night. If Tim had been a bit smarter, he could have forced it open by turning the knob and pushing against my enfeebled limb. Still feeling drained, I drew from the reserves of strength that rest had barely replenished and forced myself to a sitting position. From here, I leaned forward and locked the door, then crawled/pulled myself to the kitchen, where I got a bottle of water from the fridge. There wasn't any food inside. There hadn't been a chance to unpack it earlier in the day, so I settled for munching on ice cubes from the freezer. When my thirst was sated, I sat on the kitchen floor and listened, hoping to hear nothing at all. But after a while, I discerned a soft, barely audible sound coming from behind the cabin. The unmistakable, raspy, stuttery breathing of an undead thing waiting for a victim to hunt. Tim had either forgotten about me and assumed some sort of dormant state, or was simply waiting for me to leave the cabin. The reason was irrelevant. He was out there, and I didn't have enough food and supplies to survive in the cabin. Now, deeply conscious of how much noise I was making, I laboriously made my way into the living room and climbed up on the couch with my water bottle. I cursed myself for leaving my pack outside, but accepted that it was lost. I wasn't going to risk opening the door and grabbing it. Instead, I used what was left of the water to clean out the wound, and used some paper towels from the kitchen to redress it. Not much better than the dirt and leaves, and it wasn't pretty to look at. but the skin of my thigh wasn't yet a sickly color, and the only bad smell was the blood-drenched clump of dirt. I found a pack of matches on the mantel above the fireplace. I lit a fire and curled up as close to it as I could without burning myself. As the night deepened, Tim's breathing could be heard with eerie clarity above the night's ambience. Physically, I felt awful. Emotionally, I was anxious and afraid, and could feel the encroaching depression and dissociation of having witnessed such appalling things. At some point, I must have dozed off, more comfortable than I'd thought beside the fire, because I was suddenly excruciatingly brought to a state of awareness when my elbow slipped into the flames. I cried out, jerked away from the fire, and fell over onto the floor. This sudden movement sent a monstrous spike of pain through my punctured leg, and I cried out again. This second outburst of pain caught Tim's attention. I heard his breathing undergo a staccato transformation, and then he came charging into the back of the house. There's no door there, only solid brick, and yet his body caused the whole structure to shudder with each collision. As he threw himself at it again and again, he let out a long, inhumanly sustained roar, which eventually silenced all other noctivagant sounds. That started about 5 minutes ago. He's still going, still throwing himself at the cabin. He's moved around a bit, is now attacking the left side, nearest the fireplace. Confident that it would take him a while to reach the front, if he even has any conception of the front of a building anymore, I went into the cabin's guest room and found my dad's old laptop. There's no Wi-Fi connection here, and the battery only has about 13% remaining on it, but it's enough to at least record what's happened to me. I doubt I'll make it out of here alive, so I guess I should tell my story. And Tim's. Hopefully this'll be found sometime soon if I'm not. It's a dark, fucked up thing to say, but hopefully Tim's body falls apart within the next few hours. Not for my sake, but for the sake of whomever happens to wander into these parts of the woods. If he can kill a wolf, who knows what he'd be able to do to a person. So if you're reading this, and it's not after being told to do so by me, during an interview on television, for being the first person to survive a zombie attack, then I guess be safe out there, wherever you happen to be. Thanks for taking the time to hear my story. I think Tim has made it to the front of the house. Guess I better go try and brace something against the door. I'm a college student, not really that social. I don't go to parties or anything because I get chronic migraines and the music tends to set those off. Campus is pretty nice. It's decently big and has a lot of trees, so it's not like I'm inside all day. I'm staying on campus over the summer because I have to retake organic chemistry, so that's relevant. The other day, I think it was Tuesday, I was heading back to my dorm after class. Unfortunately, I have an evening class, so it was a bit hard to see, but we aren't an unsafe campus or anything. We have streetlights and all that. I don't get freaked out walking back because the main danger is cars, and I have eyeballs and a brain. There had been this awful smell by my dorm hall for like 2 days before this, like somebody dropped a dead rat in the bushes or something. I didn't really want to go fishing around for a dead rat for obvious reasons, so I just ignored it. Come Tuesday, the smell was the worst it ever was. Smelled like somebody baked the damn thing. I finally decided I had enough of it because I wasn't putting up with the smell for another week before campus cleaners got to it. Yogurt cups on the windows are one thing, a smelly dead rat is another. I went to my dorm, grabbed a trash bag and a flashlight, and went back outside. I swear to God, the smell got worse during the 5-ish minutes I was in the hall. I waded into the bushes, waving my flashlight around looking for whatever died in there. Nothing. Couldn't find a thing. I checked the gutters. Nothing. The smell seemed to be coming from a dorm room that was by the bushes, one of the ones on the outside wall where you can basically just look in the window and see everything. So I decided to go knock on their door because I'm not the type of person to resort to calling the RA without trying diplomacy first. Just don't have it in me. I tried to go back inside the dorm hall. The buzzer didn't work. It didn't register my ID no matter how many times I scanned it. Naturally, I'm freaking out by now because I have homework, and all my stuff is in the dorm hall. This was an issue back at the start of the semester. IDs just stopped working for some reason, and campus police had to scramble to fix it. Seemed reasonable that they could fix it again, so I decided to pay them a visit. I turned to head over there, and I just saw this massive thing. Gotta be at least 8 feet tall. It was hunched over like some kind of gremlin. I don't really know how to describe it. It was just blank. There was nothing. No features beyond being vaguely human-shaped, but it was way stretched. It didn't have eyes, no mouth, no body features, didn't have hands either or feet, didn't have on any clothes. Nothing to make it clear that this thing even had bones or flesh or anything. Looked like a rock, kinda. Except rocks don't smell like a dead raccoon that's been left under a trash can in the sun for 5 days. I just kind of stared at it for a while. Can't tell if it saw me. It eventually started coming my way, and I think I nearly died of a heart attack when it did. But it walked right past me to the dorm room I wanted to check out. Went in through the window, didn't even open the damn thing. It just squeezed through like it's made of liquid or something. After that, I just stood there for a bit. I didn't know what to do. How do you even react to that? There's a big thing that smells like a corpse, and then it goes into your dorm hall through somebody's window. You try reacting to that. I went to campus police. They were completely unhelpful, as expected. The ID wasn't even broken, so I wasted 10 minutes of my time for nothing. I went back toward the hall and nearly tripped over some random object in the road. Read it. When I tell you I almost threw up, I mean I almost threw up. There was an arm in the road. Just a whole arm, rotting away, with worms crawling in it and everything. I almost tripped over an arm. I accidentally squished one of the worms that had crawled away from the arm when I stumbled, and good Lord, that thing was full of grossness. That thing was leaning out the window of the dorm hall. The same window it squirmed into the dorm hall through, and it was just there, leaning out with its head pointed at me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Everything smelled like rot. I thought I was going to die. And then it just went back inside like it was never there. The window was shut the whole time. So anyway, I'm staying at a hotel now. I've already involved local authorities, so I'm hoping this gets resolved at some point. Still want to know what the hell that thing was, but the only thing coming up is those night crawler things, and it wasn't one of those. There haven't been any missing person reports recently either, which makes things even more confusing because that arm was still pretty fresh, even though it smelled like a 5-week-old pizza. Not sure what to do, and the thought of going back to campus at all makes me want to curl up and die. I figured I'd share this here since everywhere else is a dead end. Sorry for the long post and all that. Here's hoping I don't die in my sleep or something. Last summer, I went out into the wilderness with a buddy of mine, Mark. He'd been out to the place a few times and decided it would be a great experience for me to get out there before I started to settle down with a job. It was generally what you would expect: fishing, hiking, driving around the mountains. But I saw something out there, something I can't explain. It was the last day of the fishing trip, so Mark and I decided to stay out a little later than usual. We knew we weren't going to catch anything, we never did, but it was more the pleasure of being out there with a friend than anything. Buck, Mark's dog, laid his head on the side of the boat to watch the sunset. Out on the lake, the sunsets were always a lot shorter than I expected. Before we had even reeled our lines in, the sky was already dark, and Mark flipped on the headlights of the boat. We were a ways out from shore, so we made up our minds to start back. About halfway there, I noticed something rustling in the treetops. Mark had told me these woods were full of owls, and having grown up in a lifeless urban sprawl, I was curious. In our week on the lake, I hadn't seen any animals in the forest, and I was intent on returning home with something to talk about. "Shine the light over there," I said as we approached the shoreline, and he obliged. The light flashed through the branches and produced nothing but a rapid rustling. The light must have scared him off, Mark told me. We tied the boat in place. The boat belonged to one of Mark's friends, who had fashioned a sort of makeshift dock for it, and walked into the trees. We were probably 100 yards from our car, but we had a well-defined trail ahead of us. Buck, stoic and trained, hadn't worn a leash in years, and he led the way in the dark. A couple of dollar store flashlights lit our path. Eventually there was a stretch on the trail where the trees got thicker, and you had to duck to fit under some low-hanging branches. Buck moved through with no problem, while Mark and I had more trouble trying to dodge thorns and climb over limbs. At a certain point, we heard Buck start barking. I'd heard him bark maybe twice years ago when he was a puppy. This was a sort of ungodly howling that followed him as he darted into the woods at full speed. "Buck!" Mark called after him, but it was too late. He shone his flashlight into the thicket. "We can't see anything like this. Let's go in there." We made our way through the bushes, feet getting tangled on roots. Buck's howling was still audible somewhere in the distance. "I just don't know what could have set him off like that," Mark told me. "Since I got him, I trained him as a guard dog. He never flies off the handle. Maybe he heard a car out on the road, or maybe he's chasing that owl." "No, you know Buck. He doesn't do that. This isn't like—" Mark lost his footing and let out a yelp that pierced the silence of the forest, sliding down the side of a shallow hill. The fall didn't look too bad, but he had taken it at an awkward angle and hurt his knee. "You okay?" I asked him as he wobbled to his feet. He took a few strained steps before leaning on a tree for support. "I don't think I can keep moving through this." He swatted at a woody vine. That's fine. The trail's not too far back. Just get to the car. I'll grab Buck. Call me if you need me." Mark gave a pained wave and I kept moving. Immediately I felt uneasy. Mark knew this area much better than me, and I instantly recognized how useless I would be on my own. I did my best to follow the sound. After what felt like 10 minutes of aimless meandering, I finally found Buck. He was staring intently up the trunk of a wide oak tree, his barks growing raspier as he wore out his throat. I called him to me, but he acted as if I weren't even there. When I tugged at his collar, he snarled at me and started pulling on my jeans. He returned to staring up the tree. I raised my flashlight and looked up through the leaves. My heart sank. From between a mess of branches, a pasty, impossibly thin face stared back at me. I could describe it in great detail if there were any details to describe, but the face simply appeared to be stretched skin with two small, beady eyes. A wide mouth completed the picture, lacking teeth and lips. I fell backward and started to run. Buck was no longer intent on hunting the creature and sprinted ahead of me. I could hear it leaving a wake of rustling leaves. I could feel its presence bearing down on me, and all at once my nostrils were filled with a thick scent that reminded me of mildew. Every other step, my arms were getting shredded by thorns. Several times I knocked my head on low branches, but my stride had to continue unaffected. As I neared the trail, I heard a yell from behind me. It was Mark. I figured I must have left him in worse shape than he thought. With a busted knee, he couldn't outrun whatever monstrosity I was trying to escape. I turned back and ran towards the yells. The dim beam from my flashlight waved in every direction, and I feared the creature would know exactly where I was. As if my situation couldn't get worse, my phone began to ring. Not a quiet vibrating or a low melody. A high, screeching ringtone that they could probably hear in Canada. I saw that it was Mark and answered while I ran. "Mark, where are you? I can't find you. I've been in the car for half an hour. Where the hell are you?" And then it struck me. That thing had stolen Mark's scream. I raised my flashlight straight ahead. There it was, looking. The forest was silent for a moment. The creature opened its mouth and yelled Mark's yell. I ran faster than my legs would carry me, stumbling and scrambling my way through the natural death trap of roots and bushes. A lack of common sense urged me to look back. The creature followed me on all fours, unbalanced but impossibly fast. My body turned on autopilot. I can barely remember the details of the chase. I remembered being disoriented and dehydrated as I finally reached the road. The truck was ready to go, and as I emerged from the tree line, Mark looked confused. "Where have you been?" he said, rolling down the window. "Drive!" I yelled, and jumped in the back of the truck. Buck had made his way into the truck bed and was whimpering with his paws over his face. The creature did not follow me out onto the road, but as we sped away, I could see a pale figure moving through the brush. I don't know what it was. I asked Mark, and he said he hadn't seen anything like that in any of the times he had gone up to the lake. I'm still not sure if he completely believes me. All I can hope for is that someone reading this does and can help me understand what this thing is. Against my better judgment, I feel the temptation to come back, to return with a camera or a gun, anything that might help me get closer and prove my story.